Hi and welcome to the first example material tutorial that we're going to show you. Hopefully these give you some understanding of how the materials work in Trainz and you can use them on your own content. So the first one that we're going to go through today is a rust material, which looks a bit like this in Trainz. So you can see it's a bit shiny in certain places. This material is made up of a diffuse map, which is the main rust texture you can see there, and then in amongst that is a specular map. You can see the shininess on parts of the diffuse texture, so that's the specular map you're seeing there. And then also there is a normal map, so you can see the tiny little bumps in between the pieces of rust, or the little rust markings. And then there is a environment map, or a spherical map that you can see that kind of changes dark and light. So it's not just the specular you're seeing there, you're seeing an environment spherical map on there as well. So we'll go through this today. We'll show you how to make it and use it on a mesh object. So obviously you can think in your head what you'd probably use this on, but you can use it on anything that rusts basically. So what you want to do is you want to jump into your 3D modeling program. I'm using 3D Max today, and import your mesh. I'm going to use box. Hopefully you have something much more creative than a box. If you don't and you need a box, then fantastic, provided that it needs rust on it, otherwise you won't probably want to use this shader. So let's put it in the middle. That is not the middle. For some reason it does think that is the middle. Okay, let's restart a second and reset. There we go. Okay, try again. In the middle of your scene, and our box we want to be 5 by 5 by 5. That's much better. Okay, let's bring up our material editor, and we will want to be using the tbumpgloss shader or material. If you want to know some of these materials, you can jump into Trainz materials, and under here there are a list of materials that are supported by Trainz, and we're going to use this one, the tbumpgloss. That's the one. So if you click on that, it gives you a bit of an understanding of what you need to set up in Max, but we'll probably update this with this tutorial as well, so you can jump on and reference this tutorial. Let's change our material name to rust.m.tbumpgloss. So this m.tbumpgloss is the essential part of your material name, and then you just give it a name at the start and a dot. So I've put rust.m.tbumpgloss. You can put whatever you want in where rust is. You can put a whole bunch of characters that don't make any sense. It doesn't really matter. You'll just want to put a name at the start. So I'm going to put rust. Then we're going to change the ambient and diffuse colors to whatever we want. I'm going to use 220 because it's a bit more brighter, and I like that in my lighting, but it's totally up to you. I'm going to lessen the specular to about 150, 150, 150, so it won't be as bright. But when you when you export this out, play around with these three colors here, because that's going to, obviously the ambient and diffuse is going to play a big role in what the color of your diffuse texture looks like, and you want to keep it a white or a gray if you want to keep the colors of your diffuse texture the way they are, the way they look like in the image. If you want it to be bright blue, put bright blue in there, but generally you'll keep it white. And your specular is going to be how strong it's going to show in game. So you don't want this 100% white, because it's just going to bleach everything. So I found 150 to be pretty good. So anyway, you can play around with that. Your specular level, our docs say to set it to 132, but again, this is something that you can play around with. Certain things don't need that much specular, so you can really bring down the specular on that. You don't have to go with the defaults. You can play around with what specular and what gloss levels you want, and I'll stick with that for now. So we come down to our maps. And first off, we want to put is a diffuse color in there, which is basically our diffuse texture. So we go and find that, and I know it's in this particular folder. We've got 3 different ones there. We'll pick our diffuse color, and once we just go check out our diffuse color, I'll explain a couple of things. This is the diffuse map we're going to use. Drop him in here. Sorry, I've been playing around with some stuff. Let's just remove that. Okay. This is our diffuse texture. It looks like a rust texture. And in our channels, we have an alpha channel, which looks like that. And it looks kind of similar to the texture over here, except we've made it black and white, and just these highlighted areas are going to be the reflection part that we want. So anything on that white area is going to provide us with some reflection, because if you look at the information online, it tells you a bit of what each of the RGB and alpha channels do. So the diffuse map, it provides an RGB diffuse color, which is basically the texture itself, is what we're going to see. So that's the RGB coloring, and then it says the alpha is the reflection strength. So if we go over to the alpha, that is our reflection strength. So anything that's black or dark grey won't have much reflection at all. Anything above that, especially white like this, bright white or pure white, is going to have all the reflection applied to it. So that's why we have an alpha channel on our diffuse map there. But in max, you'll find that once you put that, once you apply that diffuse texture in the slot there for diffuse color, you'll see that it looks a bit weird in the material editor. So when we apply that to the actual cube that we've got, or your mesh, if you were to render that out, you'll see it will look a bit like this. That is because it is saying the alpha source is being used, and if you don't want to use that to render something out, you'd put none, and it'll come out properly in max. But we actually need that enabled, because when this exports, the actual .texture.txt files will say it has an alpha, which is what we want, because we've just explained that the alpha is used in the reflection. So for the first part, we've got our diffuse texture with an alpha channel, and we have put that into max in the diffuse color spot, and all we've done is drop it in. We haven't changed anything to do with anything else in max yet. It's all set by default, but make sure you've got your alpha source in there as well. So the diffuse is in. Then we go back to our reference material, and it says we can have opacity, which we don't want. We don't want anything to be transparent, so we'll just leave that out for now. If you did want to make it half transparent, like a window or something, you can add a transparency in there. Like it will be a separate texture, and it'll be black and white. But we don't want to use that. Then there'll be a bump map, which is our normal map. We're going to add that in now. So we click on the texture slot for our bump map, and I will click on this normal map here, and you won't see, once you put it in max, you won't actually see it when you render out. Well, if we go back and turn off our alpha, you won't actually see the bump map render out very well until you enable this monochrome channel output to alpha, and then you'll see it actually render out correctly in max. I'm not sure whether it matters if you leave that alpha or RGB for when you export. I'll put it back to RGB because I know what the output of this all looks like, but if you're testing rendering in max, you might want to play around with a couple of these settings to just get the output looking correctly while you're rendering. But usually you just want to drop the textures in, and you don't want to change anything in here because it'll change some settings for the export. So we've dropped that texture in, the diffuse. We've now dropped the bump map in for the normal map, and we've left everything the way it is. You can see there's an alpha channel in the bump map as well. It's enabled, and that is because if we drop our bump map into Photoshop, you'll find we've got our bumpiness going on there, and then our alpha channel looks a bit like that, which is kind of similar to our reflection, but the alpha channel controls the specular strength. So there's RGB for the bump normal, and alpha controls the specular strength. So the diffuse controls the reflection strength and the mask of where the reflection will show, and the alpha of the normal map controls the specular strength. Okay, so that's how bright the light is going to bounce off that. So you can see that that's what we've got for our specular strength. If we jump into both these normal maps, the alpha channel, sorry, that's where the reflection is going to show, and that is where the specular is going to show. So you can see that we're limiting our reflection a little bit more so that we see a bit more specular. So it'll be nice and shiny in a lot of areas, but some of those areas are going to give you a bit of a spherical map or a reflection of the environment. That's how we get a bit more of an effect there. But you don't want to overpower one or the other. And if you make them identical, it's kind of hard to see one or the other. So you want to differentiate a little bit between them. And the specular is going to give you a bit more shininess, so it's probably best to make the specular more. But again, it's totally up to what you want to do with your asset there. So we've now added our bump map. We then want to add our reflection, and we will go and get our spherical map. So now I know it's going to kind of hard to see just in this little window here, but we have our spherical map, and rendering that out is not really going to show us anything. What I'll do is I will change some of these so you can see the render, but you can see the spherical map has no alpha channel, so it's set to none. Then we go, just so we can render it out, we're going to set our diffuse alpha channel to none, and we're going to set our bump monochrome channel to output to alpha, just so we can see it. You can see it change a little bit there. We can see it in max. So it's kind of looking still a bit ugly there, just because of the lighting probably that I've got applied. But another thing to note is our environment map is set rather high. So let me just change some of these back. This is the normal, so I want to go back to that. This is our diffuse, so I'll make that have an alpha again. And this reflection map is set to 100. So if you don't change the number here, or the percentage basically, from 100 to say 40, if you leave it at 100, there's going to be a full transparency of that reflection on your object. So we'll set it to 40 and see how that goes. So we've got diffuse, our normal, and our reflection all set in there. We've made sure it's an m.tbumpgloss. We've set up our ambient, diffuse, specular colors, and our glossiness and our specular level, and that's it. So we've made sure that texture is applied to that cube, and we'll go and export it out into the Trainz format, and I will just delete some of this. Actually, we'll make a copy, and we'll rename my coord, bump the coord up, change this to 1, and what you'll see is if I get rid of those, when we go to save this out in the right location, sorry, just wanted to rename the folder here. This is called number 1. When we go to save this out, yes, export, no animations, everything else is fine. It's now exported it. You'll see we have a bunch of files here. Diffuse has got a diffuse-diffuse.texture.txt. Now it's diffuse-diffuse because it says it's using a RGB and an alpha channel. That's why it's double the name there. And if you open it up, it says primary is diffuse.tga and its alpha is diffuse.tga because it's using its RGB channel and its alpha channel. Okay, so that's exported it out correctly. Then you've got the same for the normal map, which was mine was called material_1_normal, and it's the same. It's got a RGB and an alpha because if you remember, the alpha here was for the specular strength, the alpha on the diffuse was for the reflection strength, and then the reflection map or the spherical map itself has just got a primary, which is its RGB. It doesn't have an alpha at all. So that's been saved out. We have bumped our coord up. We've renamed it to Material Rust 1, and we'll drop this one into Trainz and see what we end up with. So that's the one we've just made. Preview the asset. You can see that cube now has that shininess to it. So you can see the specular. If you just look in the corner here, we didn't have any reflection really going on in these parts, but you can still see them light up because it is using the specular, whereas these big areas here is using the specular and the environment spherical map, which I don't believe I actually showed you guys, but it's pretty basic. It's just a circle of what might look like a cube map, but it will map to a sphere. Excuse me. But yeah, that's that texture kind of being used on that cube as an environment map or a spherical map. So I'll show you what happens if you don't use some of these alpha channels to limit where you want or mask out where you want some of this stuff to go. Which is, that's part of the whole process of making it look like it's Rust or other things that you're trying to do as well, is trying to get those alpha channels correct. So if we have a look at, let's say, we'll change our reflection strength first, which is, let's have a look. There it is. In here, let's change it to be a big block of white, just so we can understand what's going on. Wrong folder. Save that out. Make sure you save it as a 32-bit non-compressed file, otherwise you're going to have trouble. So that's saved out. Just double check. Yep. And we'll drop that into Trainz. We'll have a little think and say it's already installed and we've opened it for edit. Now we submit it. Should be it. Preview it now and you'll see that our spherical map is now taken up the entire white line there. You can see that's why it's important to map this out correctly. So this stuff's mapped out correctly, whereas this is now just a big blob of white. You can also see that the specular map's still there, showing where that's highlighted. So it's very important to get your alpha channels correct when you're using things like tbumpgloss and other materials that require them. Otherwise you're going to see some weird effects. But that's the environment map. You can definitely see it there. And the other thing that we'll do is go through changing the levels here in Max. So if we were to change the reflection to 100, which was the default, and we export that out again. Sorry, wrong. Oh no, that's the right directory. So we export that out. So now that mesh itself has excuse me, has 100 set in it. We'll drop that back into Trainz, which is not what we want. You're going to see how strong it is now. We did have it at 40%, and it was still fairly strong then as an effect. But if you don't play around with these and do a few tests to make sure you get the right levels you want, you're going to end up with some pretty average results. So there's your, that's the spherical map there. That's at a full 100% being applied to that object. I mean, it's a cool effect, but is it the effect you want? I mean, we're not probably going to put tin foil on our locomotives anytime soon, but there could be some new space age material I don't know about. But that's full 100% there. So you really have to play around with these things, and then I will demonstrate what the specular does as well. So if we drop that down to reflection to be 40%, and we'll put our bump right up to 100. Sorry, I'll do the specular in a second. But the bump's now been put right up to 100%, not 30 where it was by default. We'll close that down. And this is the same thing. You'll see the levels are very off, and it's probably something that you'll want to play around with just to get what you need to make it look just right. This is the bump or the normal. It's not as noticeable, but you will see it look a bit plasticky. You'll see these little bits of white in the bump map if you make it too over the top. I think the environment map's still overshadowing our demonstration here, but perhaps you can see it there, perhaps you can't. So the bump's the same. You don't want to overpower that. And let me just go fix my texture up so we can get it looking a little bit more normal. And then we'll change the normal back down to 30%. And I guess you can play around with adjusting the specular. I don't need to show you this. It's quite easy to do. I'll export that out again so that we've got our correct levels. And delete this. So that's all done there. Your config, it's just I guess a scenery object that I'm using. We'll put this up for free, obviously, to download the example, so you can take a look at it, play around with some of the textures. You can easily just replace the textures in this particular object to just see what works for you. You don't even have to have any new .mi files or anything to export from Max. You can download this example and you can start to replace these just to play around with what your textures and your alpha channels, these sorts of things will look like, and it'll give you a really good idea of the look that you want to achieve rather quickly. So if anybody's got any materials they want us to demonstrate or have a go at making them and putting the examples up for you, please let us know. Post in the forums. We can help out to make sure that you get the correct look and materials for your object that enhance the look of it, so you can get these specular, normals, and reflections all happening with your objects. So hopefully this comes in handy. Hopefully we see some new rust objects with some nice shiny elements to it, and obviously some rust on them as well. But again, if this helps you, great. If you need more questions, please ask them and we'll try and answer them for you.